Okay. Before I start to share, I just want to announce that this Wednesday at 6:30 Chicago time over Zoom, again, if the time is inconvenient, you can always hear the share the way you turn it, you check with Zoom for the other shiur. I'll give a share in the memory. I give it every year a share for Mr. and Mrs. Sandor Kirsch. And they were devoted members of my shul, devoted members of the Chicago Jewish community, very special people. They survived the Holocaust and they rebuilt their family here. And so I give a share this year. The share will focus on Chumash Parshas and talk about the halachic status of the avos, of the patriarchs, in regard to their being considered halachically Jewish, and in regard to the responsibility of the fulfillment of the mitzvahs. Okay, today I'll give the share on Parshas Bamidbar, but of course this year Bamidbar comes right before Shavuos. Shavuos is Sunday and Monday, so I'll draw a connection between Parshas Bamidbar and Shavuos. It's interesting that my uncle and I think the Marsha feel that it's not enough that Bamidbar come and separate, as Tosfos says, the tochacha from the Shabbos from Shavuos. It's sort of like it serves as a separation, because we do not want the tochacha to be associated with the week following the tochacha to be associated with the week of Shavuos. So, but that there has to be a special connection between Parshas Bamidbar, and Shavuos. And I assume that in Eretz Yisrael they would say there should be a special connection this year between Parshas Naso and Shavuos. Okay, but whatever it is, we're going to show a connection between Bamidbar and Shavuos. I think I once saw a medrash. This is not the focus of the shir, but the medrash says, why is it that Shavuos is celebrated after we start Chumash Bamidbar? Is because in order to acquire Torah, one has to make himself like a midbar. Sometimes we say that who is Kohen Torah? Someone who is mei misatzma bohel, in a sense, deadens himself. In other words, sometimes to learn Torah, you have to make yourself insensitive to some of the things taking place in the world. You have to limit. Of course, there are distractions that it's part of Torah that you have to be distracted. Hosek mitzvah, pat mitzvah, especially when it comes to Talmud Torah. Okay, there are certain questions about that. The Torah requires us to attend to problems that arise, but there are many distractions that it's really not necessary for us to focus on. And so the Medrash says, because this is all drush, it's not the main reason, but sometimes we have to make ourselves like a midbar, desolate, distant from all the distractions that interfere with our dedication to Torah learning. All right, now, Rashi at the beginning, now Chumash Bamidbar, it talks about Chumash Bamidbar talks about the counting of the Jews time and time again. The beginning of Chumash Bamidbar talks about the counting of the Jews. It talks about the Nesiim, the prince, the leaders of each of the tribes of the Jewish people. And sometimes, not in Parshas Bamidbar, but in future Sedras, we see how sometimes the Jewish people were led astray by some of their leaders, by the Nesiim of the Shvatim, the Meraglim, Rashi Bnei Yisrael Hema. Sometimes those who have positions of leadership lead the Jewish people astray. A person always has to be on guard and make sure that he isn't blind to what he is involved with. So, and of course it talks about rebellion, and it talks about the ultimately the Jewish people arriving at the end of their travels in the Midbar. But Rashi, at the beginning of Chumash Bamidbar, where the Torah tells us about the counting of the Jews after the Mishkan was set up, Rashi says, "Mitochi basan lefanav," because of the love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had for the Jewish people, monosan, he tends to count them. In other words, Rashi is saying that the counting is indicative of pride that a person has in his possessions. And the Jewish people are in the possession of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kishiyatzu miMitzrayim manan, when they left Egypt, Torah tells us there were 600,000 Jews. So the Jews were counted at that time. Ushenaflu be'egel. And when the Jews, many Jews died as a result of the sin of the golden calf, manan leida hanosarim, they were counted again to see the survivors. When his divine presence came upon them, and there's another text, besocham, in their midst, manam, he counted them. Be'echad b'Nisan hukam Mishkan. On the first of Nisan, the Mishkan was set up. Uve'echad b'Iyar manam, and on the first of Iyar, he counted them. So the whole purpose, so the purpose, according to Rashi, part of the purpose of the counting of the Jewish people is to demonstrate the love that God has for the Jews. And interestingly enough, not just for the Jewish people as a nation, but for each individual Jew as well. And the Ramban suggests other additional reasons why God counted the Jewish people. But it's interesting that God counted the Jewish people 1 month after they set up the Mishkan. And the question is, why did God, what is the message that we can learn from the fact that God had Moshe count the Jewish people only a month after the setting up of the Mishkan? Why couldn't it be simultaneous with the setting up of the Mishkan? Why not? And if there was, because they were involved with the special karbanos, it could have been a few days later. It could be by Hibim Achras. It could have been the next day. Why was it a whole month? Now, the Mishkan represents Hashras Shechina. It's revelation. And the truth of the matter is that there was revelation even previously. We see by the Yam, at the splitting of the sea, the Jewish people said, Zeh Keli V'Anvehu. And the Medrash says it was like they pointed to the Shechina with their hands. Figuratively, of course. With the finger. So, what's the idea that he counted them? He counted them with the Hashras Hashchina, with the setting up of the Mishkan. But and a month later, what's the idea? And the Jewish people, and what was the purpose of the Mishkan? The purpose of the Mishkan was the perpetuation of Matan Torah. The Ramban, I always mention the Ramban. The Ramban says that the theme of Chumash Shmos is Yetzias Mitzrayim, is the Exodus. Matan Torah, that's part of the Exodus. But the question is, what is the second half of Chumash Shmos that deals with the Mishkan? What is that doing in Chumash Shmos? It probably would have been more appropriate for it. The Ramban doesn't mention that point, but that's obviously the question he's asking. It would have been more appropriate than Chumash Vayikra. So why is it that the setting up of the Mishkan at length and time again, the Torah actually repeats a number of times about the setting up of the Mishkan, of the collecting of the materials that were necessary for the Mishkan, and how Moshe inspected the work that was done. The Torah doesn't try to save words when it talks about the construction of the Mishkan. Why discuss the Mishkan at such length in Chumash Shmos? And the Ramban says that the purpose of the Mishkan, and I've mentioned it many times, was to serve as a vehicle to transfer Kedushas Har Sinai, the sanctity of Sinai, to Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash. Today is Yom Yerushalayim. In a sense, the Beis Hamikdash, the site of the Beis Hamikdash, not the Beis Hamikdash itself, unfortunately, but the site of the Beis Hamikdash was returned to the Jewish people. Yerushalayim, to a large degree, that's part of the Beis Hamikdash. So Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash are the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And the Mishkan itself is the enabled Yerushalayim to serve as the perpetuation of the Mishkan. The Mishkan, the Mikdash, they are the perpetuation of not only of the Torah. It had the Luchos, it had the Best in Hagadol, who was in place of Moshe Rabbeinu, who were the Amud Torah Shebal Peh, the pillar of the oral tradition. So it's the perpetuation. It is the perpetuation of Matan Torah. And I think the reason is, and so it was on one hand, there was the perpetuation of Har Sinai from the perspective of the giving of the Torah. But in addition, as I always mention, Il Kervanu Lifnei Har Sinai V'Los Nasan Lanu Es HaTorah Dayenu, that just coming to Mount Sinai itself would have been a great accomplishment. And the question is, what would have been the great accomplishment of coming to Mount Sinai and not receiving the Torah? Kervanu doesn't mean that God brought us close to Mount Sinai. Kervanu means God brought us close to himself. He brought us close to himself at Mount Sinai. So, in a sense, the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash, the purpose of the Mishkan, was in a sense to perpetuate that experience, the experience of Har Sinai. The experience of Har Sinai was the feeling, the sensing of the presence of God. But it was more than just the sensing of the presence of God. At Har Sinai, of course, the acceptance of the Torah, the Nasa v'Nishma. And as I've mentioned many times, the Nasa v'Nishma had its foundation in the Ke'ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, that the Jewish people were like one person with one heart. Because when we said Nasa v'Nishma, we accepted the Torah, not just for ourselves as individuals, but for all Klal Yisrael. And I think it's more than just that. And I'll discuss it in the share. When we said Nasa v'Nishma, we said Nasa v'Nishma for future generations as well. And so when we perform mitzvos, we have to perform mitzvos in a manner not only to satisfy the way we do it, but somehow that it should serve as an inspiration for future generations to also be committed to Torah and mitzvos. As a matter of fact, Chazal tell us that the neshamos, the souls of the Jews of all generations, stood at Mount Sinai. And I want to suggest that perhaps that's why God counted the Jewish people a month later. Let's say in Chutz La'aretz, when one rents a house, so you have 30 days to put up the mezuzah. 30 days represents the idea of dwelling. And what was the purpose of the Mishkan? What was the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash? The purpose of the Mishkan and the purpose of the Beis HaMikdash was for God to dwell among the Jewish people. V'asu li mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, and you shall make for me a mikdash, and I shall dwell in their midst. And we saw there are two girsas, two texts in the Rashi that I just mentioned. Uchsheba shchinaso aleihem, when his shchina came upon them, or when it says Uchsheba shchinaso beineihem, when the shchina came among them, he counted them. B'socham, Uchsheba shchinaso b'socham, in their midst. Ba'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'socham, in their midst. In other words, the Mishkan was not just a place that you left your house and you traveled to have an encounter, to have a meeting with God. But the idea of the Mishkan was that God was constantly in the midst of the dwelling of the Jewish people. The Ravid Shita is that the Beis HaMikdash, that today there is no real sanctity to the Makom HaMikdash, to the site of the Beis HaMikdash. The Rambam's opinion is that even today there is complete full sanctity to the Makom HaMikdash. If somebody is tamei, if someone is contaminated, according to the Rambam, there are areas of the Beis HaMikdash that if he goes in a state of contamination, he's chayav kares. He's in violation of a very strict prohibition. Ravid Shita, there are questions exactly what the Ravid's opinion is. But the Ravid's opinion is today that the avoda, there's no way that the avoda, the service can be done at the site of the Beis Hamikdash. According to the Ravid, there isn't that strict prohibition of someone who's in a state of contamination coming to the Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because according to the Ravid, there is only a chiyuv. You can only so long. Two things he says. First of all, he says that the Beis Hamikdash can only be built at a time when there is Dushas Aretz, when the land has sanctity. And according to some opinions, when the Jewish people went into exile, the sanctity of Eretz Yisrael, the Dushas Aretz, that is the prerequisite for the mitzvos hakluyas paretz, like Trumos and Maestros, Bikurim, Leket Chikha and Peya, all these mitzvos are dependent upon Dushas Aretz. What does Dushas Aretz from a hashkafa perspective mean? Dushas Aretz from hashkafa perspective means that it's the dwelling place of the Jewish people. And we paskin after the first exile, because the Jewish people conquered in the time of Joshua. How did they sanctify the land of Israel? Through conquest. So when the conquest came to an end, and the Jews went to Babylonia, to Babylonian exile, the sanctity of the land, in a sense, was removed, because the identification that the Jewish people at that time had with the land as their residence. Israel, Eretz Yisrael, is always the possession of the Jews. It was given by God to Avraham Avinu. But there's a difference between possession and residence. So where it became their residence through conquest, when the conquest came to an end, the dusha, the sanctity, came to an end also, because it ceased to be the residence of the Jewish people. And according to the Ravid's opinion, the Rambam disagrees, but according to the Ravid's opinion, the site of the Beis Hamikdash lost its sanctity. Why? For Asuli Mikdash v'Shachanti v'Socham. The Beis Hamikdash was to make, for God to become the neighbor of the Jewish people, to live together with the Jewish people, not just to have an encounter. Today we have religious encounters. Encounters are not enough. Can't just have an encounter with God. Bilam had an encounter with God. Jewish people have to have a shachanti b'socham. God has to live in our midst. And the second Beis Hamikdash, there was a dispute. When the Jews went into Roman exile, whether the Dusha remained in Eretz Yisrael or not. And according to those who say, the Rambam among them, that the Dusha remained. Why is it? Because there the identification wasn't through conquest. There the identification came because the Jews went up on the land and worked on the land. And that identification. Armies conquer territories. At one time they said the sun never set on the British Empire. But India and all these other colonies of England are no longer identified as the British Empire, because the identification with the British Empire was through conquests. And when the British control over the land ended, it ceased to be the residence of the people of England. However, when you go up, that's a different type, and you work on the land through chazaka. That's a different type of identification. That's kitchel l'shaita, but kitchel l'asad-lavo, according to many opinions. So let's say when I sometimes leave my house, I have an appointment in New York. I have to go to Strike's Matzah factory. Or I have to visit people at weddings or whatever it might be at Simchas. But my house here in Chicago still remains my residence. So so that's why some say that with the second Churban, the Beis Hamikdash, Eretz Yisrael remained holy. And as a result of that, according to many, the Rabbi disagreeing for other reasons also, the Beis Hamikdash retains its kedusha, because even though the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it's still the land of Israel is the residence of the Jewish people, and the Mikdash is Vasuli Mikdash Shachanti B'Socham. God has to reside within the residence of the Jewish people. And we couldn't even suggest that the Rambam also agrees, but the Rambam felt, as he says, that once it becomes God's residence, it remains God's residence. The residency of the Shekhinah is a permanent residency. But in order to build the first Beis Hamikdash, to sanctify the area as the place for the Beis Hamikdash, it's only after the place is the residency of the Jewish people. For Asuli Mikdash v'Shachanti b'Socham, you shall make for me a Mikdash, and I will dwell in their midst. And in a sense, that's what all of Chumash, the Parshas Bamidbar is about. What is the Parshas Bamidbar? It's about how the Jewish people camped around the Mishkan. How when they moved around the Mishkan, around the Aron. It was the residency. So because when Ba'asuli Mikdash, when you make a residency for God, it has to be together with the residency of the Jewish people. Ba'asuli Mikdash v'Shachanti b'Socham. But residency is not an encounter. You can't come for one day and say, this is my residency. So in order to demonstrate that the purpose of the Mishkan was not just to be a residency, but the purpose of the Mishkan, and this was the purpose of Matan Torah. The Mishkan is the perpetuation of Matan Torah, was for God to reside among the Jewish people. So because of that, when did God count them at 30 days? Because that was a demonstration. At that point, there was a demonstration that HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Jewish people were dwelling together. And unfortunately, I think this is the challenge of our time. Everybody wants religious encounters. Everybody goes to Israel on a religious trip. But the question is it an encounter or is it a relationship? And the purpose of the counting was to demonstrate the relationship of the residency. Now, it's interesting that one of the big questions asked is one of those questions that there are 100 answers to. And I would say 95% of them are correct. Usually it's the reverse. even when you have many answers. The question is, the halach is, ein bonin beis hamikdash b'layla, ein bonin mikdash b'layla. You can't construct the Beis Hamikdash at night. Only in the day you can construct the Beis Hamikdash. Nevertheless, women are required in the mitzvah of binyan Beis Hamikdash, in constructing the Beis Hamikdash. But the simple answer is that the building of the Beis Hamikdash, that's the Maisa mitzvah. That's the action of the mitzvah. The fulfillment of the mitzvah is in having a Beis Hamikdash. Why? Because having the Beis Hamikdash, that's a demonstration of HaKadosh Baruch Hu living together with the Jewish people. It's having the Beis Hamikdash is the fulfillment of the mitzvah, and that's a mitzvah that applies day and night. There is no moment when that mitzvah doesn't apply. Consequently, it's a mitzvah that's not dependent upon time. Now, it's interesting, and I saw in the Archbishop Chumash a mention in the name of Hagon Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal. It says, when you look at the three countings that Rashi mentions here, so one counting is when they went out of Egypt. There, they weren't counted by their shvatim, by their tribes. They weren't counted by their families. And then after the Egel again, they were counted, Minyan HaNisharim, the survivors. Again, they weren't counted by their tribes. They weren't counted by their families. But only at the Mishkan, they were counted by their tribes and by their families. How are we to understand it? And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky suggested, according to what's written in the Archbishop Chumash, that at that time, originally, there was some concern that if you focus on them as separate tribes, their sense of nationhood will become very weak. And it was important for the Jewish people to, in a sense, to understand the significance of being a nation, being a nation. Consequently, they weren't counted by their tribes. And it's interesting, is a similar idea not mentioned that way by the Maharal. When the Maharal discusses the Maharal discusses the Isa of Arayas, how people are not allowed to intermarry within the family, brothers and sisters, parents and children, grandparents, they're not allowed to intermarry. And the Torah is very strict about it. And so the Torah said, that the Maharal says, why? Because in ancient times, there was a tendency to intermarry within a family. And the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim seems to indicate that there was such a natural tendency also. It's difficult for us to understand it. After all, when you think about incest, we just shudder. But there was a tendency to intermarry within the family. And besides the morality and the health issues that there is, The Maharal points out that people only intermarry within their family. So the bonds that hold a nation together, that hold different families together, will become loosened. So that's a challenge the nation has in creating bonds between people and between families. Because if everybody withdraws only within his own family, the perspective of nationhood falls apart. And it was important for the Jewish people at that time to preserve the nationhood. And Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky says, but once they had the Mishkan, so the Mishkan served as a bond that kept them as a nation. So they were able to count them as families, as shvatim, as tribes. This is what Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky is going to suggest. I want to suggest that the way that I want to suggest possibly another answer, and the ideas that I suggest perhaps be used to explain the answer that was given by Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. Now, it's interesting, the Medrash tells us that the Jewish people, that the Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Yaakov, when they carried the Aron of Yaakov, when they carried the coffin of Yaakov from Egypt to Eretz Yisrael to be buried in the Maras HaMachpelah. So when they carried the coffin, they carried it in the same way as their descendants, in the same order as their descendants camped around the Mishkan. Now, how are we to understand this medrash? I've asked this question many times. But the answer is, when a family has a patriarch and a matriarch, so there are strong bonds that exist. If it's grandparents, there are strong bonds that exist, not only between brothers and sisters, but there's a strong bond that exists between cousins also, if it's a grandparent. Everybody comes to the grandparents' house. Today, that's less so. But at one time, people would come for Yontif to their parents' house, and they brought their children with them. They came to their grandparents' house. There were strong bonds. But after the matriarch or patriarch of the family died, there would be occasional visits, occasional encounters. They would come to weddings. But the relationship that existed before is no longer there. The bond is not there. Why is it that the Torah identified, according to the Medrash, the way the Jewish people carried the coffin of Yaakov with the way the Jewish people camped generations later around the Mishkan? But I think, as I mentioned, the Jewish people, when they left Egypt, they faced a challenge. Because the challenge was, on one hand, a challenge of family. Because when you're slaves, when parents are sold away from their children, and children are sold away from their parents. And true in Egypt, everybody was the slave of Paro. But you could be transferred to one group to another group. The Medrash tells us that at the Kriyas Yamsuf, when the Egyptians drowned, people were able to tell among the drowned Egyptians who their master, their submaster was. They were able to recognize their faces. Apparently that was necessary for the Jewish people to get rid of their servile perspective, to see that the one who ruled over them in particular was dead. So, in a sense, Avdus, slavery, interfered with the parent-child relationship. It interfered with their family relationship. And certainly they did not have a real national relationship at the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, at the time, up to the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, up to the time that they left Egypt. They were not in control of their own destiny. And I always mention, why is it that the Seder, there's such a strong emphasis, the child-parent relationship is emphasized at the Seder. Why? Because Eved lo yichus, a slave halachically does not have pedigree. It's not that it should be that way, it's just expressive of the facts. Because children of slaves are sold away, are given away. The parents are given away. There couldn't be a strong bond. And the demonstration of freedom is creating bonds between parent and child. But you got to tell So the Jewish people, on one hand, had to strengthen their family bonds. They had to strengthen the bond between parent and child, between members of the family, between brothers and sisters, between cousins. On the other hand, they had to form a nation. And sometimes that dual obligation, one runs counter one to the other. And by the Mishkan, the purpose of it, it's interesting. There were 4 camps around the Mishkan. There were 4 camps around the Mishkan. And each camp had a flag. And one side, the flag on one side, according to the Medrash, had the letters Aleph, Yud, Yud. The flag on another side has Beis, Tzadik, Ayin. The flag on the third side had Reish, Ches, Kuf. And the flag on the fourth side had Mem, Kuv, Veis. What does all that mean? But when you put these letters together, you have Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Avram is not spelled Avram, and Yaakov is not spelled with a vav. That's not an unusual occurrence. But what's the idea? The idea is when a family is together, the parent is there, even if the parent passed away. When the family is not together, if the parent passes away, there's no sense of family anymore. So the idea of the Mishkan, when the Jews circled around the Mishkan, it wasn't only the religion of the Jewish people. It wasn't only that God resided among the Jews. But it was much more than that. It was, and the two go together, because we have to remember that we are chosen by God because of our ancestors. And it was the Mishkan. The Jewish people are a nation, but they are a nation by virtue of them being a family. It's one thing to be a family with your children and your cousins and your uncles and your aunts. But as years pass by, that sense of family diminishes. Each person has their own family. And that the idea of that central family becomes weaker and weaker. And unfortunately for the Jewish people, because we are unique in that, of course, we need a land, but we are a nation even when we don't have a land. And when a Jew is in trouble in one end of the world, a Jew at the other end of the world should be and is usually sensitive to the needs of the Jew at the other end of the world. Why? Because there is a sense the Jewish nationhood is based on familyhood. Now, and it's interesting. And the idea, but it's not just a family in terms of this generation, in terms of my parents, in terms of my grandparents, in terms of my great-grandparents. We have a sense of family to those that we know. But Jewish familyhood is something that stretches not just 3-4 generations, but it stretches throughout Jewish history. And it includes future generations as well. When the Jewish people said Nasa v'nishma, as I said before, when the Jewish people said Nasa v'nishma, they were saying Nasa v'nishma, not just, they were saying Nasa v'nishma, not just for that generation. When they accepted the Torah, as I mentioned, they were ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, like one person with one heart. And that's the symbol in the Mishkan and the Beis Hamikdash, the Kruvim, as I mentioned. Upneihem yishalachiv, they faced each other. Osin ritzono shel makom, that's the symbol of Osin ritzono shel makom. Why? Because that's the symbol of Matan Torah. The symbol, what was the prerequisite of Matan Torah? Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, with one heart, like one person. When their backs are turned to each other, when we ignore a fellow Jew, that shows that we're not perpetuating Matan Torah. But when it's Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad, then it's the perpetuation of Matan Torah. So the Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad is not just one generation, it's for all generations. B'shamru Bnei Yisrael es ha-Shabbos, lasos es ha-Shabbos l'dorosam. When we observe the Shabbos, we have to observe the Shabbos in a manner. I think Rabbi Moshe Feinstein said that. We have to observe the Shabbos in a manner that will inspire future generations as well. So this is the sense. So our nationhood is based on the idea of familyhood. And what is Matan Torah? Matan Torah, the Medrash tells us that on one hand, the famous question Tosfos asks, On one hand, we have Midrashim that say that the Jewish people said Nasa and Mishma, and they were on a level higher than Malachim. On the other hand, the Midrash says that Kof Aleim Harkigigas, that God raised the mountain over them and said in Kabbalah and Torah Mutav, if you accept the Torah, it'll be fine. Bimlav, if not, Sham Tehek Forastem, there you'll be buried. The Jews were forced to accept the Torah. How are we to resolve that contradiction? I heard from my father, Shnei Ksuvim Machishim Zeh the Medrash says that the Jewish people, when God said, wanted to give them the Torah, he asked for a surety. And they offered the Avos, the patriarchs. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu rejected it. And only afterwards they offered their children. In other words, the Jewish people were ready to commit themselves to the Torah. They were to commit their avos, the patriarchs. That was very easy to do. The patriarchs were dedicated to the Torah, were dedicated to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Future generations, they weren't so sure. Who knows? Who knows what my grandchildren will encounter? Who knows how they'll be able to make a living? So Kaf Aleim Harkigikis doesn't have to be taken literally. Sham didn't say Po Tehek Furastem. This is the teretz I heard from my father. Sham Tehek Furastem. If you think later on, the Torah, it would better them for not to be committed to Torah. Sham, there will be their destruction. There they will be buried. You have to inspire your children. You have to inspire future generations now for the acceptance of Torah. In other words, the idea of acceptance of Torah is Masorah, but it's not just Masorah. It's the idea that we are all together, in a sense, all generations are together. And it's interesting, it's the holiday. It's the holiday of Gerus, Shavuos. We read Rus. What is the main focus in Rus? The main focus in Rus is Chesed. To help one another. Now, Rus shows Chesed to Naomi. Boaz shows Chesed to both of them. It's not just Chesed. Boaz tells, you'll eat with my workers. Don't consider yourself an outsider. Because once you enter Klal Yisrael, you're not just part of the nation of Klal Yisrael, you're part of the family of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people. This is the idea. And if we have the attitude of family, of Klal Yisrael, the way people have the attitude that as time passes, as years pass by, the bonds become weaker, then the Jewish people as a nation will become weaker, because we're not a nation like every other nation. Yes, we're a nation because of the Torah, but the way we're able to survive Golus, exile, and even in Eretz Yisrael, the way reason to be committed to Torah, to perpetuate the Torah, is because we have this sense of family. And I would like to say that Matan Torah is the linkage of generations. All Klal Yisrael, as I mentioned, was there at Matan Torah. And Matan Torah was the holiday of Gerus. The Jews, according to most Rishonim, they were Jews. They had Dushas Yisrael beforehand. We find that Basya went through Gerus in Egypt, and so many other rayos that there was sanctity of Israel before Matan Torah. So what was the Geirus of Matan Torah? I heard from my father, he has a long share on it, that beforehand there was individual Geirus. However, when at Matan Torah, there was Geirus of the tzibur, of the community. Till the time of Avraham, till the time of Matan Torah, each person was a Jew in himself. For the time of Matan Torah, they went through Geirus that the Jewish people as a nation should be a Jewish nation. And what does the Geirus manifest itself? In recognizing, how do we become a Jewish nation? By recognizing that we're all descendants of Avraham Avinu. And this is the idea of Geirus. A ger is ben Avraham Avinu. A ger is a descendant of Sarah Imenu also. The Medrash says that Sarah nursed, after Yitzchak was born, Sarah nursed many children, and their descendants became Gerim. And the Medrash says, Eim Habanim Smecha. So you see, not only Avram was the father of the Gerim, Sarah was the mother of the Gerim as well. And all this comes, it's part of joining the nation of the Jewish people. And the idea of nationhood of the Jewish people is that we are the relatives, that we are a family. And it's very interesting. And I mentioned on Shavuos, we read Rus. The whole idea of Rus is chesed, tzedakah, helping the poor. When the Torah, very often when the Torah talks about tzedakah and helping the poor, it talks about your brother being on bad straits. Tzedakah is not just giving money to an outsider. Of course, there is stuck in that. Even when you give money to a non-Jew, there's a form of tzedakah as well. There's discussion, but when it comes to giving money to a Jew, it's not just giving money. It's the idea of emphasizing the relationship that exists between me and him. He is my brother. And in a sense, it's the record. We have to recognize tzedakah as a demonstration of familyhood. And perhaps that's the reason why halachically the first to get are members of your family, because in a sense we have to show that the mitzvah of tzedakah is a demonstration of familyhood. So Shavuos, which is the time of Matan Torah, when it's K'ish Echad B'Leiv Echad, it's a demonstration. It's a time that we have to show. It's a time of Chesed, and tzedakah has to be seen as familyhood, and more important, it can't be just temporary familyhood. Familyhood, as generations pass by, become weak. The bonds between families become weaker and weaker. The familyhood of the nation of the Jewish people cannot become weaker. On the contrary, we have to work that it becomes stronger. That is what Shavuos is all about. That is what Matan Torah is about. Matan Torah, the Jewish people came to sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it was a permanent relationship. It was dwelling in our midst. But dwelling in our midst doesn't mean that just God has to dwell with me. God has to dwell with the Jewish people. He has to dwell with my whole family being the family of the Jewish people.
If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. One question that was from before, you said you were going to mention two things about the Ravid, and then we think you only mentioned one.
Now, the Ravid also says that even if we say that Eretz Yisrael is Kitchel Shaitav Kitchel Asad Lovo in the second base of Mikdash, which is the sheet that he's inclined, nevertheless, the Makom HaMikdash, the side of the Mikdash does not retain its Kedusha because Ezra knew that the base of Mikdash was going to be destroyed. And since he knew it was going to be destroyed, he stipulated that the sanctity of the Beis Hamikdash should only last as long as the Beis Hamikdash lasts.
That's Rav Zalman of Volozhner's Kach Nigla Lo Misad Hashem Lireyav.
Huh?
What you just said is Rav Zalman of
I never heard that was from Salmon. I heard from my father that Kach Nigla Li V'Sod Hashem L'Reyav. My father said that he thought it was a mistake in print, and instead of Li, it should be Lo.
Oh, your father's chat. Okay.
That was my father's shot. I actually didn't hear it from my father. I heard it from a Lubavitcher rabbi in Massachusetts who told it to me that he heard from my father. And then I asked my father about it. My father said, yes, he said that.
Okay, there aren't any other questions, so everyone have a good week. We'll send another
Wednesday
email about the
6:30.
Wednesday 6:30 Chicago time.
We'll send out notices.
Yeah. Have a good week, everyone.